Elizabeth Kirkby-McLeod. Kia ora, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, I'm a total Peterson fangirl now.
Yeah.
I went to their concert last night, didn't know anything about them. My mum just saw that they were having a concert and she's like, let's all go. So we took multi-generations and we
Uh,
just had a blast. You will have a blast tonight.
and it's that kind of vibe, isn't it? It's a family band. Bring one, bring all. It's just such a special thing. And look, I'm kind of gloating because I got tickets for tonight, but I think honestly, tickets sold out to their concerts almost before the plane landed. And just wanted to say, Peterson family, if you're listening, y'all come back now, and next time book bigger venues because certainly have gone down well in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Not talking music though. Talking literature, this is your specialist topic, if you like, and loving the idea for our conversation today, the importance of rereading books, not just one and done, not just no, I've read that, put it to one side, never go back to it, revisiting some old favourites, perhaps.
Yeah, so I was reading a article recently by Matthew Mullins in Christianity Today, and he was reviewing a book which is called Deep Reading: Subvert the Vices of Our Distracted, Hostile, and Consumeristic Age, which is written
Wow.
by this. And I was really struck through reading his article at the way in which rereading is one of the most subversive forms of reading we can do.
Wow.
And are you much of a rereader?
Well, I'm quite a subversive, so that's a good start, perhaps. And yeah, I do. There's books that I go back to. There's the Bible, quite fond of that. Read it a few times now. Probably will go back to it again. But actually, there's something about rereading a book that you love, which is similar to watching a film that you love, except deeper, I suppose. It's like catching up with old friends, especially if there's real depth of character or it's a beautiful place that it's set, etc. It's almost literally taking you back to Narnia, isn't it?
Yeah, when you think about it, this is our jam, right? As
Yeah.
Christians, we are brought up to reread. We don't say, oh well, we've read the Gospel of John, tick, don't need to do that again in my life.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, it's also the way that children read. I don't know if you've ever read a book with a child and they love it.
Many
All they want to
times.
do is go back to the beginning and
And
start it
again.
again. You can read it 5 times that night and you'll be reading it 5 more the next night.
Yeah.
I have books that I just have memorized because my children love them. So there's a joy in rereading that we seem to innately have, but we lose that when we get immersed in our culture
Yeah.
because of the things that our culture value. And by saying, no, actually, I'm going to reread, we can, as Mullen says, he's got this great quote, journeying through a written work more than once is radically antithetical to our age.
Yeah.
And it's there for a few reasons. Once, if we are willing to repeat a task that we've already completed, that is really countercultural in our culture, right?
Yeah.
If we want to read something for joy rather than just because we've spent money on it or because we've got a list of books we're trying to conquer, that's also quite countercultural, doing something for joy rather than as a consumer.
Yeah.
And it also really results in a deeper understanding of a text. And I think that's also quite countercultural in an age where we just want to get the facts, read those 3 bullet points at the top of an article and feel we're an expert. And so, I was really drawn to his argument. And I just thought it comes back to that idea that there are things in life we do not because we're consumers, not because we need to, achieve something,
Yeah.
but simply for the joy of it.
I think it's maybe slightly different between fiction and non-fiction. Like non-fiction in some ways it makes sense. If this is a how-to book on motorcycle maintenance, you're going to reread it because you might need to change the carburetor again. I don't even know what that means, but theoretically. However, if it's a fiction book rather than a how-to book, where the reason that we're rereading is quite different. It's not utilitarian at all. It's more relational or perhaps even spiritual.
I totally agree with that. I think there are books that you're constantly dipping in and out of. A cookbook, for example, right? I'm not sure if that's exactly what Mullins is talking about when he talks about rereading.
Yeah.
I think that's more like re-referencing. And I think it's always good if you can re-reference. But when you say a motorcycle manual, versus something like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance,
Exactly.
which was
I was thinking
a more
of that.
philosophical book, where you're going back to it for the ideas. Or, as you said, you're going back to something for the characters, for the place, for the story. Narnia is a fantastic example of that, because I would imagine that many of our listeners have read that more than once, perhaps because we've read something ourselves as a child and then we want to share that with our children or with our grandchildren. But you don't need that excuse to reread something that you love. It doesn't have to be because, finally I've got a grandchild. I've got an excuse to reread my favorite texts. Go back to them. Give yourself that permission and see it as a way in which you are shrugging off the values of our current culture and putting on the values of joy, which we know is a Christian virtue.
I want to try an example on this one because I suppose the classic disposable novel is, for example, Agatha Christie. Okay, I know who did it now. I've read to the end of Agatha Christie. I don't need, it's not going to be the same again. I'll grab the next Agatha Christie book and I'll read that again. But actually, if you know how the story resolves itself, because chances are, and you'll be able to give insight to this as an author, chances are the author knew where the story was going to go before they wrote the first word. So if we can, I suppose, take that journey as the author did, where they knew where they were going, but they weren't sure how they got there, and to be able to see the clues and the seeds and the scenery along the way, you take a different view of a journey once you know where the destination is than you do more if it's like, let's see where this goes, I suppose.
So that's that deeper understanding, right? And you're quite right. You've got the surface level understanding of the mystery. You've figured out who done it. But often people will finish a thriller and they will want to turn back because they want to know the breadcrumbs. They want to understand the red herrings that were laid out for them and why they were misled by them. And those skills, when you think about it, I mean, I want to say rereading simply for joy, but that's actually wisdom we can gain through that, isn't it? If we go back and we figure out why we were misled by red herrings, what were the breadcrumbs that we missed? Those things will go in and percolate and become useful in other ways.
Yeah, no, certainly. Again, bit of a personal question. Is there a book that let's take the Bible off the list. Apart from the Bible, what's the book that you've reread the most? Elizabeth, what do you think?
So I'm actually quite a big rereader, and I think we've talked about this before with the classics. So your Jane Austens, I've reread them, many times. Your Chronicles of Narnia. I love going back to children's books I enjoyed when I was younger. So I've reread Swallows and Amazons series just for myself, and I've read a couple now to my children as well. Yeah. And I've just actually completed rereading the Anne of Green Gables series.
Wow.
It really struck me, particularly the last couple of books where Anne is growing up, how differently I responded to them as an adult than I did as a child. And I found them really beautiful books. And in those books, she's dealing with, she has a child that dies, she's married. There's things that would have just completely depths that would have passed me by at an earlier stage of my life that I've just really enjoyed going back to over the last 6 months. And that's another thing, we change. Yeah. And as we change and as our experiences change, we may go back to a text and discover things we love. But I've equally had books that I've gone back to that I thought that I loved and actually realized how shallow their ideas were. And, at a certain point, I was obviously shallow enough to think they were awesome.
Well, hey.
So I've had that experience as well.
That's a part of the learning opportunity. And you and I have talked about this beforehand. The classics are perhaps more up for a reread than some of the pulp fiction that's being churned out at the moment. And talking about the utility of rereading. Some books are just churn. There's a utility. Okay, we find out what happens at the end, we move on. That actually they don't have the depth that are worth a reread. That perhaps some of the classics that are classics for a reason. If somebody's thinking about rereading, perhaps the classics are a good place to start.
It's a little bit like worship songs and hymns, right?
Yeah.
the thing with hymns at church is that often they've had to have something special about them to survive 200, 300, 400 years, right?
Yeah.
We were singing at church on Sunday, and him and I realized it was by Charles Wesley.
Mm-hmm.
And you think, oh my goodness, like there must be something in this that has survived and that has a strength and a virtue and a deep theology to it, that we want to pick it up and continue to sing it hundreds of years later. And I think that's the same with classics, right? Of all the books that were written in the year that the Anne of Green Gables book that I just finished, Anne of Ingleside, was written, there would have been hundreds. But the reason that hers is still in print, the reason we still read it, is because it's sifted to the top, perhaps. And that's what I love about classics. You know, it's sifted through the top.
And hey, a bit of a challenge, a bit of a weirdo for people listening today. Well, you know, there's always going to be a new bestseller, but why not revisit and reread some of your personal favourites? Elizabeth, thank you so much for your challenge, the work that you do. Thanks so much for chatting with us today.
Thank you, Andrew.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.